Thank you, Kimberly. Um, wow. Well, it's really great to be here. I guess I'll do a quick what happened and or what it was like, what happened and what's like now, and then I'll get into some yoga. I haven't really told my story in a while. Let me see. So what happened? What it was like is I was very typical. I was like a big book alcoholic, it's like when I read the big book, I immediately identified I was like a 30s drunk or something, like I would have been in and out of sanatoriums, blackout drinker at 14, went to 4 high schools, got into a lot of trouble for drugs and alcohol at a time when no one would, you just got kicked out of school. No one would be like, you wouldn't get any treatment. They'd just be like, oh, you need to go. So it's like, you need to go. So that was like that was what it was like, is I was just that like incomprehensible demoralization. I think that's the phrase. There's a lot of phrases from the big book that really kind of captured it. The one that stuck out to me, so I got sober on May 21st, 1990. I was 26 years old, and I just I had the incomprehensible demoralization thing, and I'd had it for a while. I just didn't really understand myself or my life, and I knew that I was killing myself, but I didn't know that there was anything I could do about it. And just to kind of, I won't get into too much detail because it's just another drunkalogue, but I mean, I did black out. So I got sober on a Monday. I blacked out from Thursday to the Sunday. And so I remember drinking on a Thursday afternoon, and kind of the next thing I knew, I was going to get something to eat on a Sunday afternoon. So literally in my last 4 days of drinking, I don't remember the last 3 of the last 4. So that's kind of extreme. I'm kind of, I think I qualify. Um, and so on that Monday morning, I woke up, and what I would do is drink in bed and read. Like the reading would take me out of myself. I would later understand. I would later read the book, "The Craving Mind" by Judson Brewer, and he's this MD PhD researcher who puts people who have meditation training in MRIs and watches the brain when it's not meditating and watches the brain when it is meditating. And our default setting is called the narrative network. And when it lights up in the brain, we have a self and thoughts about the self, right? And when I was hungover, having a self and thoughts about the self was like horrible. And so I would just manage, having a self and thoughts about the self by drinking and reading, because that would take me out of having a self and thoughts about the self. Some of you may understand it being uncomfortable to have a self and thoughts about the self in the midst of a hangover. And so the way I'd manage that was I would read. And that particular morning, I was out of books. All I had left was this big book. Now, what had happened 2 weeks before, I'd gone to an AA meeting in Germany. I was in the army at the time. I go to this AA meeting, and I don't remember much about it, but I was out back smoking, and they came out and said, "Hey, you've won the lottery," and they gave me this book, and and I was like, "I won the lottery." I don't remember being in the lottery, but I was delighted that I had won the lottery. I don't get any laughs for that line. I'm like, that's really funny.
I laughed.
That's like really funny. I'm like this idiot now back smoking cigarettes and like, hey man, you won the lottery. Here's the big book. I'm like, oh great. Wow, I won the lottery. So I got the lottery, and I got the book, and I just put it on the shelf. And 2 weeks later, I was in need of a book to read to manage my hangover. And I had a very little amount of alcohol. I had about this much alcohol left in a bottle. And so I was going to save that for emergencies. So I wasn't drinking yet on that morning. I was just going to read this book, and that was going to be enough to kind of quiet my mind. And it looked like a good enough book. Like I didn't need the best book in the world. I just needed a book to read to quiet my mind. And so I read, I think it's the doctor's opinion, and the line that stood out to me was that he compared it to like cancer, where like if someone has cancer, um, everyone feels sorry for them, but not so with the alcoholic. And then it says this line, for with this disease goes the loss of all things that make life worthwhile. And that line felt exactly like where I was. I was in the process of having lost all that makes life worthwhile. Later that year, the year I got sober, Bonnie Raitt was having this like comeback and got a bunch of I think I guess you get Grammys if you're a musician. So you got I think 5 Grammys that year for for an album called Nick of Time. And my parents sent me like a magazine with her on the cover of it because they're like, you know, like they knew I was in recovery and like, hey, she's in recovery. So they mailed me this magazine, and I got interested in Bonnie Raitt. And this one of the songs in that album says, what was it? No promise left unbroken, no painful words unsaid. And so I'm just one of those people who had like a thorough bottom, right? Like it was thorough. No promise left unbroken, no painful words unsaid. It was like I rode that one. I kind of did my bottom the way I did my drinking, right? It's like I've never made that connection, but like, yeah, I didn't like drink a little, I drank a lot, and I didn't bottom out a little, I bottomed out a lot. So when I read the big book, I was like, oh, that's definitely me. And then they said, you know, what we do is we pray. I'm like, oh, all right, you know, I mean, that sounds fine. I had like did poured out the alcohol one time and found and had the worm and tequila. So I'd eaten the worm and tequila in hopes of something positive happening. I'd done mushrooms that same night. Actually, I did the worm and I did the nothing happens with the worm, by the way. It says you'll see colors, you don't. I ate the worm and I ate mushrooms that same night. And so I was that kind of guy. I did like LSD and went to the police, you know, when they were on tour. And so like if I can do that, I can like I can pray. I didn't have filters. So I was like, who cares? Like I don't have resistance to prayer. I have no experience in it, but I was like, oh, well, they say pray. So I'd seen like the Norman Rockwell painting of someone praying. So I was like, oh, I should get down on my knees and put my elbows on the bed like they do in the painting. And I asked God for help. And it was a very eloquent prayer. I'm not sure what I meant to say when I got down on my knees, but what I said is, please take the pain away. And it was like that. I got up from my knees and I knew it was going to be okay. And I poured the alcohol away and I was like, good to go. I'm like, I'm sober now. And for like 2 days, I'm like, I'm sober. I don't remember what I did during those 2 days, but I was like very sober. And I told my friend Mike Ross, who was like this army guy I drank with, I was like, yeah, I'm sober now. I had this blue book and I'm not sober. And Mike Ross, who I had done major blackout drinking with in Germany. And when you're doing blackout drinking in Germany, you are definitely blackout drinking. Let's say those guys do it. They sell alcohol in the gas stations. At least they did when I was there, right? And Mike turns to me and goes, "Oh, great. That's great. You know, my uncle's 20 years sober in Arizona and he still goes to meetings." And I was like, where have you been, Mike? Like for 3 years, I've been my own worst enemy. And like, you're telling me this now. But that was the kick in the ass that I needed. I went to a meeting that night, met my sponsor, Henry. And Henry and I decided that I should go to rehab. And so I went to rehab for 6 weeks and kind of the rest is history. I learned kind of how to do spiritual practice in 12-step meetings. And I'll just say a couple of the basics of 12-step meetings and then I'll transfer into yoga. I was describing to someone today how like I heard somewhere that happiness happens when you get what you want and joy happens when you do what you're fashioned to do, right? And and one element of what I'm fashioned to do is to be here. I've never been so happy in my life as I was in a 12-step meeting, you know. And then later on, I was never so happy in my life as I was in a yoga class. And then later on, I was never so happy in my life when I was in a meditation hall. I just like being with you all. I like being with people doing spiritual practice. I'm not interested that I'm not all that interested in, like, you know, barbecues or, like, you know, that kind of stuff where people are doing small talk. But if people are gathering around spiritual practice, I'm here for it, you know. This is what I'm fashioned to do. And Kimberly's like, hey, do you want to do this? I'm like, yeah, of course. And I respond to my community. Like I saw my puppy this morning. Like, we lost our dog in the fall, and I was like, okay, like last time we waited a year or two to get another dog, and I was like cool waiting, but my family rallied, and so I have this little puppy. I'm gonna show you guys. I'm gonna show you the picture. So this is me meeting my dog for the first time. Her name is Zoe. She's like a husky mix. But I think she's gonna be called Piper. So this is, let me see if I can, the lighting doesn't really work. You can, wow, maybe if I do this. Oh, I see, it's the light behind me. Can you guys see little Zoe in there?
Yeah.
See her little white paw on my, what you want to see is how she's putting her nose in my neck and her little paw on my shoulder, right? This is how she welcomed me. She was just like, oh, it's my people. Like a puppy just thoroughly jumps up and hugs you. You know, oh, you're my people, you know? And there's a way that she just, that's what dogs are fashioned to do, right? Is to love us. That's our saving grace, is they love us. And so she just jumped up and she started licking me and nibbling me and licking me and just hugging me. It was just like, you know, this is what she's fashioned to do. And the first thing that I discovered that I was fashioned to do is to show up to spiritual community and spiritual practice and just like and get it, you know, like that I'm supposed to come, I'm supposed to listen, and I'm supposed to learn with my whole heart and soul. And I'm supposed to be grateful, right? It's like I'm supposed to show up, I'm supposed to be honored to have a chance to be a part of this community. I'm supposed to listen to the best that I am able. I'm supposed to follow instructions to the best that I am able. Like this is my opportunity. This is what I've been waiting for my whole life, is to be a part of a community where I'm accepted, where I belong, where I'm taught what I need to know in life. This is the shit, right? This is where it's at. You know? It's like, oh my God, there's a place for me in this world. Are you kidding? Sign me up, man. It's like, there's a place for me in this world, and this place for me in this world is unlimited. I have unlimited welcome here. I have unlimited welcome. You know, how many of our fellow addicts have lived and died without a day of unlimited welcome in their life? My sister died that way. My best friend died that way, never tasting for a second what it meant to belong, to get some guidance, to get some hope, you know? And so not only do I participate in spiritual community on behalf of my own spirit and my own heart and my own mental health, I do so for all the people who need us to do so. We need each other, right? So I got that. I remember I was maybe 10 or 12 days sober. It was before I went to my rehab. I'm the only person that I know of who ever went to rehab. I was 2 weeks sober when I went to rehab. So it was a 6-week rehab, and after 2 weeks, I got my 30-day chip. And everyone in the meeting not everyone in my rehab was like, "What is wrong with you?" Like, this is like completely like aberrant that you're like, I'm getting my 30-day chip. We've been here for 2 weeks, right? But anyway, I went to that's another thing that like always cracks me up, because I'm picturing the guys that I went to. I was in an RB rehab, and I'm picturing all of them. All of them like showed up like after a bender, and I like showed up sober. but in those 2 weeks before I got sober, it meant that I had to detox on my own, and so it was like very little of those 2 weeks, like there's a lot of like blur in those first 2 weeks of sobriety for me. But I just remember being at there was this thing called the international meeting. So I'm in Germany, and some of our meetings happened at like on military bases, and then on Saturday afternoon we'd go to the international meeting, and that's in Frankfurt, Germany, and it meant that like it was civilians were there, and it was English speaking, but it wasn't just army guys. And and I'm sitting there in the meeting, and I'm in like some form of like self-imposed detox, right? So I'm like, nah. And I realized that this woman next to me is having a spiritual crisis. Like she's thinking about leaving her marriage, and she really honestly needs to talk to someone about this. And she's chosen to talk to the 12 or 14 people around this table in this church, and I'm one of them. And for the first time that I knew of, someone thought I was trustworthy, thought I was someone who would listen to them, thought my listening mattered. It was an incredible honor to be one of the people this woman had chosen to share that life moment in her life. And I knew, and every single time I would go to meetings after that, I went every day. I was like this, I went, to a meeting a day and doubled up on weekends for the first maybe 5-6 years of my recovery. And every time I went, I knew that like my being there mattered. I knew that just being there and listening was a huge contribution, and that it was an honor to be able to make that contribution. I didn't need to make much more of a contribution in the world. Like I was like waiting tables and delivering packages. And so on the external, my externals were quite humble, but there was tremendous meaning and purpose in my life because I was one of the people sitting in the meetings as people came in and chose to save their own lives. I was part of how people were saving their lives every day. And I wasn't in the market for more, So, okay, so what happened? Well, how did yoga show up? Well, the first things first, I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is where Jack Kornfield came back from. Jack Kornfield is like, one of the founding fathers of, I guess, white, white American Buddhism. And he came back from Thailand in the 70s and went to a Harvard PhD program. But he's like a little Johnny Appleseed. So there was like a meditation center right there on, still probably is there on Broadway. It's a street in Central Square. And then there was a meditation center in Barry, Mass, that he founded. And so I'd be going to meetings in Cambridge, and everyone who was like kind of in the know and had like, recovery were starting to hit meditation. They'd actually go and get formal instruction in meditation because that was part of the 11th step. And at this point, I was a rule follower. I'd been like I wasn't a rule breaker. I was a rule ignoranter. Like I didn't really know what the rules were, I was like, what, that's a rule, right? And so I hadn't really been paying attention to what the rules were or weren't, I was like, I think there's a specific term for what I was, I wish every once in a while it comes up, someone who is completely outside of the law. I was like, that's how I lived my whole life. I was indifferent to the laws. I wasn't like privileged. I just knew for a fact that if I followed the laws or didn't follow the laws, there would still be a negative outcome. So I might as well enjoy myself. I had kind of a very negative attitude. But by the time I was 18 months sober, I was like a rule follower. I was like listening closely to what the rules were and like what you're supposed to be doing and how to do it. And then I would do it. And so the 11th step was like, go figure out meditation. So I bought a book and I started reading. It was Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. I'm like, well, that's good. I'm a beginner. So I started reading the Beginner's Mind, because I was a beginner. And there's a meditation hall, like, walking distance from my house. And so I like trucked on over and I started meditating, and I immediately started liking it. Okay, so that's just part of my life now. So now I bought a chair because I could not sit on a cushion. So I had my little special meditation chair, and I had a timer, and I'd count breaths, and I was a meditator. About 2 or 3 weeks after I started meditating, my sponsor, Forrest, got into the car. I was like, what happened to your car? My car had always been a mess, like a mess. Like, those guys with like the super messy cars, that was me. You could find like a hamburger from like 4 days ago underneath the seat. That was me. And Forrest gets in the car and it's like clean. And he's like, Rolf, what happened to your car? And I'm like, meditation. It's like me and meditation clicked immediately. It was just like meditation gave me like this wonderful calm and this energy. People complain about meditation. I was never a meditation complainer. I really enjoyed I enjoyed not having the suffering that I had all the time. I should mention that I had, and the Buddhists call it stored tension. The rest of us call it PTSD. I don't know which is a better way of describing it, like picture like, is that PTSD or is it stored tension? Right? However you want to describe it, my blood pressure when I was 28 years old was 140 over 90. And I'm 57 years old now. My blood pressure is, I think like 118 over 76. Like I've like reduced the amount of stored tension in my body. Does that make sense? Yes. And I'm less likely to go off. You can imagine that someone walking through the life like this is pretty ready to go off, right? And as I reduced the stored tension in my body, there started to be some inner space. So I love meditation. And then a couple of years later, someone told me about yoga poses. I'll be honest. There was a little lady who had my eye on across the way at the meetings, and it turned out she was a yoga teacher. I was like, oh, all of a sudden yoga seems kind of interesting to me. So that so that was the first time yoga came across my screen. I'm like, oh, that's interesting now. Yoga is really interesting to me. Unfortunately, nothing came of that. But then my girlfriend, future fiance, future wife went to Kripalu one fall and brought back this leaf that was like huge and gold and orange. And at this point, I'd already started to pick up on the frequency and vibration, because like meditation makes you connected to the subtle. And I was like, wherever that, I could just feel the vibe of the leaf. Like if you go to Kripalu, they have leaves like they're this big, they're enormous maple leaves, like no lie. I used to think like, was I overestimating this in my memory? But I've gone back in the fall and I've seen leaves that big. They're that big. And I was like, I want to be where that leaf is. And I took my first yoga class there, and I didn't really do it very well. I'm sorry to say, I don't want to disappoint anyone, but I wasn't like, I wasn't like an expert. I did my first yoga class. At one point they had us in bridge pose, and I was literally like, they won't break me. Because I just knew like sports and like the army, and so it's like your yoga teacher is trying to break you down to build you up. And I'm like, they won't break me. At one point, I think I said something like, you can't smoke a rock. And so that was like my first yoga class. So I wasn't exactly like skillful, but I like walked out on my way to breakfast. Like you do yoga before breakfast there. It's a great policy. And at the time you could walk around barefoot. You can't do it anymore. But I was like walking barefoot on these halls. And I'd been exercising. That was like maybe 1994. I'd been exercising since 1979. And I'd never felt that way after exercise. It was like my hips were looser and my feet were meeting the ground more skillfully. And there's my whole skeletal system was like moving more efficiently, and with more like, there's just something about walking to breakfast that was like, damn, I'm gonna do more of that. If there's been one saving grace to being an addict, is like when something feels good, I perk up, and so like meditation's like, okay, you don't have to tell them, you don't have to invite me to that party twice. At 12-step meetings, you don't have to invite me to that party twice. Yoga, okay, I'm in, right? It's like sweet. I've told people who I train, like, you want students to feel successful. You want them as they're walking back to their car to be like, that was a good thing. I want to do that again. Because they don't have to understand yoga for a long time. Let me check and see how much time I have left. Oh, I got like 10 minutes. Um, so
No, Rolf,
what?
you have you have 20 minutes.
Oh, great. I got
Yeah,
20 minutes. All
you
right.
have as long as you want.
All right. So now we'll get into some theory because she talked me up about the whole yoga theory thing. So I should probably talk a little yoga theory. So I'm walking down the hall and I'm loving yoga and I did yoga the way I did like meetings. I mean, to this day I'm like, I do something yoga-ish every day, unless I'm really, really like I made the mistake. I haven't done like high intensity interval training since COVID started, and I went back to it. My birthday was the 3rd of February, and I got like a exercise bike for my birthday, and so I started creeping back into some like kind of functional strength training, and I did burpees for the first time in a year on Tuesday. Now, the reason for burpees is I live in California now and I surf. And if you're like a 50 something surfing, burpees are a really good idea because they do the same motion as popping up on a surfboard. And my 57-year-old body just is not, it's not like fashioned for popping up on surfboards anymore. It was maybe when I was 25, but at 57, it would prefer to like sit on a couch. So I've got to kind of train my body up to popping up on a surfboard. And the easiest way to do that is to do burpees. And so if I really want to be out there with my son, I got to be able to do like maybe 100 burpees a week. And so I was like, well, I'll just do 50. Well, apparently doing 50 burpees after you haven't done one for a year is a bad idea. So like my shoulders are killing me. And so I haven't been exercising for a couple of days, but short of doing something really stupid, I'll do some kind of practice every day because it releases that stored tension thing. And yoga's been my primary thing since probably 1994. All right, so yoga. Let's talk yoga and let's talk addiction, shall we? Ready to go? That was my story. You heard it. You guys gave me a life second to none. I started really doing yoga when I became an addictions counselor and I was working with kids with trauma. And that's great. I think addicts are particularly good when it comes to working with kids with trauma. But also we have to be careful because we get re-traumatized by the kids' trauma. And that's what happened with me. And so I started having vicarious traumatization working with kids with trauma. And I found that doing meditation and yoga was a way for me to keep myself safe. And so I started getting more and more, the more and more I went down the path of service, the more and more I went down the path of yoga and meditation. And I started having this whole routine where I'd wake up in the morning. This is the VHS days. So I'd wake up in the morning, I'd do my meditation, and then I'd do a VHS yoga tape. And I was like doing that every day. And I was just like really great, And so I'd finished this work I'd done as a counselor, and I was going to graduate school. And in the break between work and graduate school, I did my YTT at Kripalu. It was just an excuse to do 30 days in July at Kripalu, which is like a sober person's vacation. If you haven't been to something like Kripalu, go when you can, you know. I will defend that in some ways by saying that when I was going there at that time in the 90s, it was like $80 a night. You got room, you got board, and you got all the yoga that you needed. And I was making like $17,000 a year at the time, but I would like save up my pennies and I'd just go for a week. And it was like the best vacation I could think of for a sober person. It's a good idea. It's got trees, it's got a lake, it's got instruction and pranayama and meditation and yoga. It's just it's a great sober vacation. And also neat people to meet. So I went through my training and I've been teaching since 1997. So let's just get cut right to the chase. The Yoga Sutras is something that I teach, and the Yoga Sutras are kind of like picture the manual for something, but really more than a manual. Picture like a recipe. Like how you follow the instructions for a recipe to make a cake. Well, in the Yoga Sutras, there's the recipe for how to do yoga pose. There's a recipe for how to do the breathing. There's a recipe for how to do the meditation. There's like these recipes. I think I'll actually share a recipe with you before I'm done. I'll teach you the recipe for how to do a yoga pose. There's like a recipe in there for like, how do you do a yoga pose? Well, as a matter of fact, there's a recipe. How do you do the breathing? Well, there's a recipe. So the Yoga Sutras are kind of the recipe book. You guys get that?
Mhm.
Yes? It's the recipe. And I'll give you an example of that. The first thing that we need to know as recovering people is that we're on the right track, in the sense that when that whole identification thing, like, hi, my name's so-and-so, I'm an alcoholic, and then people from not that community are like, why would you label yourself that way? Well, as a matter of fact, yoga says that the cause of human suffering is not knowing who you are. And the path to freedom begins by remembering. And so the word in the Buddha's language, sati, for mindfulness, is translated as remembering. And so the translation for the word mindfulness is remembering. And the first 3 sutras, check this out. This will probably be resonant to you. Yoga Sutra number 1, and now I begin to guide myself. Right? And now I begin to guide myself. Talk about like a resonance for that first year of sobriety, right? It's like once the dust settles and you start to like know that it's possible to not die of your addiction and there's something you can do about it, and you start making some strides, there's this moment where you're like, and now I begin to guide myself. Like you have been given, I feel like that first 3 months or 6 months in some ways like a free gift. And it's like you just by the grace of God end up not having died and you have 6 months. But there's this moment in the first year where you start to be like, oh, I know what I remember buying my first sober shoes. It was like the first, I put them on and I started walking around and I kind of knew that like these sneakers, because they were sneakers, are going to be with me. I'm going to wear these sneakers out sober. I bought them sober, and I will have them until they die sober. And at that time, I was still like cycling through clothes that I had worn drunk, a car that I drove drunk, right? A life that had like held, and I just started to acquire things that were not of my drinking life. I started to have things that were no longer identified with that, like sober shirts and sober pants and, and a sober roommate, and and there's this moment in recovery where, and now I begin to guide myself after all the crap, after all the confusion, after everything. And now I begin to guide myself. Second Yoga Sutra, into the present moment where the war in my mind will cease. And I think this is another thing that shows up for us. We sit down in these meetings and the war in our mind ceases. We don't really know why, but we just know that the war in our mind ceases. And to me, it's like, well, what's happening? You sit down and you start to pay attention. What Judson Brewer said is that your narrative network deactivates and your experiential network activates. Like when we're truly listening to one another, right? We move from the self and thoughts about the self into timeless, selfless awareness. And when we're in the experiential network, the war in our mind has ceased. And so there's this is a mindfulness practice that we're doing this is a remembering practice. I remember going to meetings and identifying with all these people that I had been told I didn't need to identify with. I come from a patriarchal world, 60s and 70s America, and it stunned me that the people I was identifying with were women. I was going to these meetings and it's just like, she's telling my story. Like identifying with, coming from a male from a patriarchal world, listening to women and being like, that's my story. That's my story. She's telling my story. The same thing happened for me with the LGBTQIA community. I come from like a homophobic world, a patriarchal world. And I just remember listening to people who were members of the LGBTQIA community being like, they're telling my story and I want the best for them. And I'd been told, like we've been, there was this very dark distance that I'd been taught to place between me and all these different groups of people. Like, I'm not, it's like when I was in the military, I had no concern about harming people from other militaries. It's like, who cares? This isn't my concern. I had no crisis of conscience around being in the military. It wasn't my concern. I've been trained to have no concern around how my behavior could, say, harm another person. Or let's say that person has a family. I had no concern. Well, I started to get some concern, right? I would go to meetings. It's part of the beauty of it all. Is like, I actually have a concern. Like, I have a lot of concern. I want the best for these people. I want the best for everyone I listen to. Every last person I've ever listened to, I've wanted the best for. I have a lot of concern around what happens to humans. That's actually authentic to me, right? And so in the present moment, when we start listening to each other, something very healing happens. I had been told that story about Bill Wilson going to Dr. Bob's house a million times. Like, raise your hand if you know that story, right? You know that story. You guys know that story, right? Well, Bill W. is like 3 months sober, and he gotten sober through the power of prayer, but he had no community. And so he goes to Akron, Ohio on this like business trip. It doesn't go well, and he's alone in his hotel lobby, and there's a bar there. And he wants to drink. He realizes he's about to maybe die. And so he gets resourceful. He calls a local minister and he asks him, do you know any drunks in town? He's like, as a matter of fact, I do, Dr. Bob. And so Bill Wilson goes to Dr. Bob's house, sits in the kitchen, helps Dr. Bob, and they found AA. Great. I've always thought that the story was like Bill Wilson helped Dr. Bob. As I was writing my last book, I was looking at these archetypal moments in the 12-step tradition, the yoga tradition, the Buddhist tradition. And I realized that as I like researched that moment, what that moment is about, when Dr. Bill and Dr. Bob are at the kitchen table, what heals Bill is that he's listening to Bob. He's listening. He's not helping Bob. He's listening to Bob. What heals us is our ability to listen to one another. It's the listening. It's why, like in meetings, you spend like 3 minutes sharing and 57 minutes listening, because it's the listening that matters, right? So in the second sutra, it says that when we enter the present moment, the war in our mind ceases, right? And then we're able to rest in our true nature. And so I'm listening to these people in meetings, and the war in my mind ceases. And I begin to understand my true nature, not because I'm sensing it in me, but I'm seeing you and I'm hearing me, and I'm starting to understand my true nature. And there's a phrase that what I can forgive in myself, I can forgive in you. But it kind of worked backwards for me. What you were making the same mistakes I was. And you were easily forgiven. You tell your story of letting down this person, letting down that person, letting down yourself. And I would see the beautiful human behind, the unskillful behavior. And I'd want the best for you. And that slowly allowed me to want the best for myself, right? And to be able to start to heal my relationship to my true nature. And so let's just say this for, brevity's sake, that what I tell teachers is that yoga, first and foremost, is about remembering who you are, and that we can't remember who we are unless we're in the present moment. Also, that this remembering is a process. It's a verb, not a noun. So it's not like, well, I haven't done it yet. It's like water on a stone, this remembering who we are, drip, 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 drip. Remembering who we are. And from that self-definition flows wise attitude and wise effort, right? Like attitude and effort flow from self-definition. So it's truly appropriate and powerful for people in recovery to say, hey, I'm in recovery, because self-definition drives behavior. Our behavior will make sense to our definition. Um, let's see, a lot of chat. I'm almost done here. Let's see.
Well, you can feel free to take, I mean, like 10, 15 more minutes, and then we can open up to Q&A. And
Let me just, we'll do Q&A sooner. Let me just close. I want to share with you one more thing and then have you feel something.
okay.
So there's a Sutra 3.9, which basically says that, so we have these habits of the mind that cause us to suffer. And with practice, we have these habits of the mind that cancel them out, like the habits of the mind that cause us to suffer begin to arise. Like a simple habit of the mind that causes us to suffer is to compare your insides to someone's outsides. Doubt is another, habit of the mind, doubting yourself, doubting your community, doubting your practice, doubting this, doubting that. And so these habits of the mind arise kind of unbidden, but we can, over time, unskillful habits become canceled out by skillful habits. But this whole process, initially, it's very deliberate. And so what you hear in meetings is people say, I had this unskillful pattern arise today, and then I remembered what I learned in meetings, and I consciously canceled it out with this skillful, I called my sponsor, right? I did something skillful, something unskillful was happening, and I chose something skillful. And what 3.9 tells us is that this process becomes integrated. It's like you're learning Spanish. Initially, you're like, okay, and you look up the word and then you say it. But like, if you think about learning a language, eventually that stuff gets automated. And you can just have this intentions and the words come smoothly out. That's real here, guys. It gets better. It gets better. And it's worth the time and it's worth the effort. I can't think of a better analogy than like learning a language. People come to meditation and they're like, yeah, I went to meditation, but it didn't work. It's kind of like, yeah, I went to a Spanish class and I can't speak Spanish, so I didn't go back. It's like, guys, like put a little effort in there. It's like, have a little wisdom, have a little patience, right? Have a little wisdom, and if you don't have wisdom or patience, you're surrounded by role models of wisdom and patience. Like I didn't have wisdom and patience for my first 5 or 10 years of recovery. So I didn't need it because I was surrounded by wise, patient beings. And I could just be like, I could just kind of hang out with them. If I didn't have it, I could just be in their energy, and they could keep me from harming myself, but it gets better. All of this gets better. We get better at loving ourselves. We get better at delaying gratification. We get better at empathy. We get better at faith. This year, with COVID, wasn't as hard for me. 2008, my family was like broke and I had young children and it was hard and scary, but I chose faith, and it's faith in myself, faith in my family, faith in what we do, and we made it through financially, but it was a very hairy time for us. When the economy fell apart, like we were in a very we had made some decisions professionally to transition. It was we were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it was a scary time to have young kids. And the same is true for the yoga industry this year. Like in 2020, the yoga industry took a huge hit from COVID, but 12 years later, I didn't have half the suffering. I just knew, I knew the drill. I knew to have faith in myself, faith in my family, faith in the world, faith in each other, and just to do my thing. I knew I knew how to respond wisely. Does that make sense? And so I had a blink. I remember in April being like, my wife telling me, everything that we plan to do this year to support our family is not possible. Oh, well, that's bad. That's unfortunate. And I think that some of you may be able to identify with like, everything gone. This entire industry gone. Opportunity gone. Pathways to any kind of money gone. Financial responsibilities in place, right? Same financial responsibilities, no opportunity, right? You know, what are you gonna do, Ranger? And but this time I just know it was the same kind of challenge, if not worse, but it was like a lot less suffering. And so 3.9 gets better. Let's feel a recipe. Okay, so our ancestors wrote down how to do a yoga pose, how to do the breath, how to do the meditation. And so we don't have to make this stuff up. It's just there like a recipe. So let's feel the recipe the ancients created around how to be in a yoga pose. And it's just only 3 ingredients, and we'll see if you can't feel them. So go ahead and take a seat. You want to kind of have your back away from any support. Although if that's not good for your body, you can have your back supported. There's just something about having to use your core a little bit to stay upright in the flow of gravity that kind of wakes things up, you know. So, and being awake is kind of helpful. Let's take a breath in and a slow breath out. Yeah. So in the first ingredient is called Yoga Sutra 2.46, which says that we find the middle between being steady and at ease. So let's find the middle let's get a little too hot. So get kind of tense. We're gonna get too hot. I'm scrunching up my face and scrunching up my body. So it's kind of hard to breathe. Now let's get too cold. So now you're kind of schlumping, maybe schlump. I'm even schlumping my lips. I'm gonna come into a schlump. That's too cold. Now let's find the middle between hot and cold. Just finding the middle between hot and cold. Breathing patiently. Deep and patient breath as you come to rest in the middle. In Yoga Sutra 2.47, this is the second ingredient. We stay in the middle, but notice that when you're in the middle, the subtle aspects of your experience become available. So you can hear the world around you. You can feel the air on your skin. And you can sense where in your body you're holding tension. And so in this second ingredient, we notice where the body is holding tension, and we begin to relax that tension. If the tension is a tightness, it may make sense to breathe some space into the tightness. But to do so patiently and gently. And so we step into the middle and notice where we're holding tension. And we begin to allow the body to let go of what it's holding on to. In the third ingredient, Yoga Sutra 2.48, it says that as you As the body lets go, we begin to experience peace. A peace that was always there. Coming to rest in the peace that was always there. Just take a breath in and a breath out. And then softly open the eyes. Alrighty, so that's just an example of a set of steps or a recipe in the Yoga Sutras. And you can see how it's like, oh, it's fairly approachable. People think of the Yoga Sutras as like dense or this, that, or the other, but it's pretty approachable. Could you guys feel that? Give me like a thumbs up if you could feel it. Yeah. So it's just like a recipe, and and then if you practice, you can imagine that you'll be more and more familiar, right? You guys made yourself available to it, and over time you'll start to become familiar with it, and you can actually teach somebody else. That's the process, right? It's like first you become available, and then you become familiar, and you can kind of make it your own. All right, let's do, I guess, some questions.
Thank you, Rolf. Thank you. I'm having this we need to clap or do something or like, thank you. Thank you so much for being here and sharing with us. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and I want to say something before we open it up, and I'm sure people will have questions. I wanted to read something at the end. This is one thing that when I first read this, I knew that Rolf was a cool guy, and it's from his book, and it's the introduction, and he wrote, he like quotes music a lot, kind of like that Bonnie Raitt, which I love. And he wrote, future generations riding on the highways. This is from the introduction. Future generations riding on the highways that we built. I hope they have a better understanding. You know who that is? Anybody? It's John Cougar Mellencamp from the song Check It Out, which we're going to play at the end of this and do a little dance party with Rolf. Hopefully he'll hang out with us. So I have it queued up. So go ahead and we'll open it up and then hang out for the dance party. That song rocks. Okay. Just feel free to raise your hand. Yeah, that's great. And then John will call on people too. Hey, Teresa.
I see Teresa.
Yeah.
Hey, I don't have a question for you. I just have a comment and just want to express my gratitude to you. I have your book, Meditations from the Mat, and I have had it for 3 years, and I have read it every single night for 3 years. And it is, I just want to express how much that you have really touched me through your writings. And I am also a yoga instructor myself, Y12 SR instructor and leader. And I do kids yoga and adult yoga as well, and meditation and that. But what you give me just keeps my light going. And every time I read it, you get something new out of it. There's always something. You can read the same thing,